G'day, my name is EB Nispel and I'm going to be bringing you a topic of balance today for the next Battlefield title. I'm going to be going over some controversial topics such as thermal optics. Does it fit into the game? Can it be balanced? Or is it something that we should leave in the past and be forgotten and carry on forward? I will also go over some things that need to be addressed as far as bugs, balancing, and other things in regards to vehicles. So sit on back with your favourite beverage and let's get into it. So now, you've probably already had a chance to play the beta and wondering if this will be a AAA game. As far as I understand, in my personal perspective, it has potential to definitely be a AAA game, but it definitely needs some work. The one thing that was very satisfied with and surprised with was honestly the infantry gameplay, which I would give a solid 7 out of 10. And the aircraft honestly needs a lot more work, a 4 out of 10 for me, with the tanks being a 6.5, with some much needed work, but definitely has good potential. Now, if at any point you find today's reflections, opinions, thoughts, or just enjoy generally the commentary and the gameplay that's playing in the background, leave a subscription, a like, or even ask me some questions, because I definitely will be replying back to everyone's questions that I have here. Now, I did have already a review video on the beta and what my thoughts are of the current game, but they were quite reserved because we definitely did not get to see the full loadouts that will be possibly available at the launch of the game. If anyone has seen temporals posts on Twitter about data leaks into this game, well, I'm just going to put up this image right now to show you what some of the potential loadouts might actually be for the tank when it comes out. Which is why the reason I kind of had a bit more of a reserved and a bit more generous rating towards the game in my original review of it. So hopefully we do see these things featured into the game, or there's definitely more things that we do not know at all and that is coming out to the game, which might make tanking more enjoyable, a bit more skillful in one regard versus another, as well as replayability and allowing tanks to have a bit more an aggressive play style in this game. Some of those things you might have already heard of from other people, your own personal experience, or once again plugging in my own video again, is the delay input in the turret. It's very noticeable when you're just in the non-zoom optics, the delay that's in it, and it's a little bit less in the zoom optics, but I honestly think that's just because you're zoomed in, you can kind of see the adjustments that you need to do a bit more in real time. But either way, it's something that kind of puts a very, you're fighting your own self to try and aim in this game, which is pretty unfortunate, because it doesn't allow for much close range aggressive gameplay for the tank. The tank actually excels at medium to long range, and so it's playing more of a supportive role. So it is still playing a contribution to the game flow and how to help a team to push on a flag, but there are some situations the tank needs to dive on a flag and use that HP that it has and the fact that it only can be damaged by certain weapons to help get the team onto the flag even more. Once again, promoting that dive play, but we need to make sure that this is balanced so that it doesn't come completely broken, which I'll talk on a little bit later. So let's get to the very controversial topic that I wanted to talk about first, and let's get it out with. So if anyone's played tanking in Battlefield 5 and Battlefield 1 and now in Battlefield 2042, you may be familiar with, if you're already a veteran of titles before those games with Battlefield 4, Battlefield 3, that thermal optics are not in the game whatsoever. And just to give you an idea, if you're new to Battlefield, what thermal optics look like, I'm providing you this game footage right now. So as you can see, thermal optics are exactly from what you might see in documentaries and other video footage of tanks. It's basically providing the thermal signature of any heat source in the game so that it comes up to you in a white dot, so to speak. Now, this provides some controversial gameplay. Now, this footage right now is the final build of Battlefield 4. If you see any earlier footage of what thermal optics looks like in Battlefield 4 as well as in Battlefield 3, it was a bit less intense as what you can see right now, but the intended purpose, what from I can see and what I personally decided from my own opinion, is the thermal optics, the way they wanted to balance it in this game is give a lot more visual ability to see what's going on, but at the cost of depth perception. But if you can already see in my footage right here, it's still somewhat generous with this, so you can actually kind of get an idea of what ranges are, what you're looking at in game still. If it did that a bit more, it would be a little bit harder for you to see. And honestly, I think the way how the thermal signatures look in this game, not to bring in my most hated quote of all time, not realistic to what it's like in real life, they could have at least had some kind of attempt where like lower thermal signature parts of the body, for example maybe the extremities where there's less heat coming through, not be able to be as visible compared to like the torso and the head, where in real life that's where a lot of thermal heat's coming out of the most of the human body anyway. And also from what I've seen from thermal footage of tanks being looked at through thermal optics, is some parts of the tank actually don't show as much as the other. Obviously the engine showing a lot of heat, but some of the chassis showing a little bit less, and it's more the moving components of the tank that actually are giving off more thermal heat, which probably makes sense with friction being a thing. But seriously, we're really not here for reality, because this is still an arcade shooter. Please, for the love of God, stop trying to convince everyone that this is a milsim game, because everyone that's been playing this game for probably the last 10 years, it is far from that. You could make the argument that it's a blend between the two, which is the way I like to see it. So, Nispel, how would you actually balance this in a game? Besides from the countermeasures that were provided in Battlefield 4, such as the flare, smoke grenades, and even the laser sight in the game, and also slams, which if you knew how to use them correctly, you wouldn't be able to see in thermal optics. Besides from the countermeasures that were provided in Battlefield 4, such as the flare, smoke grenades, and even the laser sight in the game, and also slams, which if you knew how to use them correctly, you wouldn't be able to see in thermal optics. This idea I got from Battlefield 1. Did you know one of the heavy tanks that was featured in Battlefield 1, the Saint-Chamond, actually pretty much had thermal optics? Now let me explain. Did you notice anything when that light started to flash? Look how everyone's 3D spotted right now. So, one of the loadouts for this tank was it had a searchlight. Well, when active, would 3D spot everyone and everything in front of him, and it would after a while have a cooldown time before being able to use again. Now, how was this exactly useful? Well, when you fired a tank shell, or someone shoots you with a tank shell, a smoke grenade, or rubble falls down, it causes all this dust to be kicked up. Now, when that happens, you would use the searchlight to see through all the debris and see exactly where you needed to shoot, thus making you extremely effective pushing the enemy, get into these situations where you're trying to smash a building down so that your infantry can push forward, or getting through these scenarios where large amounts of smoke and spam of a whole bunch of different particles were going across your screen, making it impossible to see. Now, when you use this, there is a cooldown time, so you couldn't use this 24/7 like you would use thermal optics. In thermal optics, all you had to do was just click a mouse button, it would be active, and then if you didn't need it, you would switch on back and then rinse and repeat, which allowed people to just kind of constantly spam between the two optics so they could see objects in front of them or be able to see the enemy better. Now, the way they've balanced this with the Saint-Chamond was simply that you're only able to use it for a significant amount of time before entering an extensive cooldown time. What if you use that for thermal optics? Just like how active protection worked in Battlefield 4, where you had to time it when you needed to push the enemy and dive onto the flag, or block a shell so that you can kind of clutch a 1v1 with an enemy vehicle, or to take a whole barrage of an aircraft strafing you. You could apply this same principle to thermal optics. This will mean that the tanker no longer can rely on thermal optics, but it can use it as a tool in the correct situation that it is needed. So now the player has to make choices of when they use the thermal optics. Do I need it to watch the spawn points in a bush on the top of a mountain? Or when I blow up this building, I know there's going to be a whole bunch of people in there, but if I don't use my thermal optics when I blow the building down, I won't be able to see where they are before they relocate themselves, so that I can't finish them off. Or do I need to search for something that's really, really far in the distance just for a little bit right here? You're starting to have to make decisions of why you need to use it right here and right now, and thus having to make a choice. Now this would give thermal optics a bit more depth of how you can use it while not being completely reliant on it 24/7. Depending on how thermal optics will be featured in this game, if they are featured, we could also make the argument that we don't have thermal optics at all, but apply the same thing that we already use in Battlefield 1 and attach a searchlight to the tank, which can use that to 3D spot everything that's in front of him, blind the enemy, or also make it a little bit harder for us to see, but you have to perfectly track the 3D spotted icons, and thus solves a whole bunch of questions of balance, while allowing for a tank to be a bit more aggressive, search for hard to see places, and generally having more impact into the game and a bit more influence. So some other things I would like to cover across from input that I have gathered from my own comments on some of my videos, as well as collaboration with other vehicle players in this game, podcasts, and second opinions. So one of the things that I reckon needs to be touched on and addressed is simply how the turret mechanics work in this game. Now, as far as we can understand from our own experience in the Battlefield beta, is simply the turret looks exactly the same as in Battlefield 5. In Battlefield 5, each tank class had a different turret rotation speed, and that's generally one of the ways they balanced the lighter tanks versus the heavier tanks. So the heavier tanks were a bit more sluggish in regards to movement and turret rotation, but they got a huge buff to their health and the damage that they could put out. So they could almost juggernaut their way through the front lines with given the right support and right situation, or just hold down areas in the open with no one able to really do anything about it, except from some aircraft and some good teamwork. But the light tanks became a bit more versatile in what they could do. With a bit more awareness, you could actually be really rewarded by able to outplay heavier tanks by shooting them in the right spot in the turret so that the turret moves slow, and you basically ring around the rosy around them until they died. You could also, with the light tanks as well, get into hard to reach places and really help your infantry out and really catch people off guard and have a bit more aggressive play style as well. It also really rewarded people that already generally had decent and good aim in the game, because it was probably the most mobile out of all the turrets in the game. And in my opinion, if you had to choose between returning to what turrets were like in Battlefield 3 and 4 versus how they are featured now, I feel like what the turret speed is like for some of these lighter vehicles in Battlefield 5 could be a good start to meeting both sides of the party and the argument, because at the end of the day, it's not returning to the whole system of you being able to do a 180 with your mouse in a fraction of a second and shoot whatever's behind you, not having really anything you could do about it, being an infantry player. And also being tankers rewarded for having good aim in the game, as well as being able to play more aggressively, because the input on the mouse versus to what you're doing in game, allowing you to track your targets and have good movement speed. And now that we know that the movement in Battlefield 21 for infantry is really good, I do not see why turrets should not get the same kind of buff and mobility to allow us to keep up with them, especially in close range. Also, one thing that probably needs to be considered as well is gyro-stabilization. Gyro-stabilization is basically where the turret had this inbuilt mechanic where when you went over certain objects or potholes, that the turret would generally keep facing to where you're aiming. So, to give you a bit of an example of this, imagine driving over a hill, right? And as you're coming over the hill, there's a bit of a pothole on top of it, and it forces your tank turret to go back up rapidly and come back down over maybe say 10 or 30 degrees, right? And as you're coming over the hill, you're trying to shoot a person and you miss because of that pothole, because of the slight depression in the ground, right? In previous Battlefield titles, that wasn't as insane, as well as having, I think, was it turret decouple was a thing as well. So that would allow you to be able to aim, and no matter where your torso of your tank really moved, it wouldn't be fighting against your own crosshead in game. So your mouse in your hand would basically sit in the same spot, and you would turn with the WASD keys and nothing will happen, as long as if there wasn't a huge significant change in the terrain that you were crossing over. So you couldn't, for example, go up a 90-degree slope and then it wouldn't do anything. That would be pretty broken. So addressing this issue in the game, especially when Battlefield 2042 is featured in the modern setting, it's a pretty common feature that tanks have, especially right now. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed, and I think, if I recall as well, Battlefield 1 had that, so question mark, I think it needs to come back. If you address that as well, a lot of tankers from previous Battlefield titles will be very happy with that as well, because it just gives a general better input as well, and also you're not having to fight yourself the whole entire time. Angle damage needs to stay in the game as well, so if someone shoots you at a very poor angle, it does less damage. Now, I'm not talking about ricocheting here, so please do not freak out, but that's something that, I'm not gonna lie, I would not care about if it comes back in, but I also would not care if it's not featured in the game. So if it comes or doesn't come in, I don't care. Just if it does come in, please make sure it's not completely broken, because in Battlefield 1 there was a bug that simply allowed it that bad angle shots were rewarded and completely flush angles actually did no damage, and that was featured in Battlefield 5 as well at some point as well. And I think there was at a point where it was so broken that like infantry couldn't even do really any damage to you at all, and it was just completely broken, and they had to like rebalance it again. So if that gets featured in the game, it adds another bit of depth. It takes a bit more skill, and I would say a bit of trigger discipline as well. It would also make the tank fights a bit more dynamic and actually reward aim even more, because you could just not blindly shoot at any flat surface of the tank. If you were shooting at something that's a bit, you know, not shaped correctly, a bit of more steep of curve on it, you would just bounce the shot, and you would have to pay the price for just using old mechanics in the game where it didn't really add much more depth to it. Because at the end of the day, the tank v1 1v1s in this game, there's not too much to it besides from movement. Optimally, you want to kind of get into a mid-range fight and then kind of dodge the shells at range, but with the shell velocity in this game, doesn't make that really a thing, so I wouldn't even really consider that. So that gives you the argument of maybe putting the shell velocity back to similar what they're in Battlefield 3 and 4, so that you can have these fights where if you missed a shot, that was the difference between you winning a tank 1v1 or not. But also at the same time, you could just add some small things like that, and it would give it a bit more depth and skill to the tank 1v1s as well. But that's a whole nother topic, which, to be honest, at this point, I would rather a whole bunch of other things be addressed anyway. So that mobility, the turret system, how it works. I honestly don't mind if there's no thermal optics in the game, but I'm willing to have that as a compromise for other tankers that might have a real personal bias that thermal optics should be in the game. Gives them something that feels inclusive of their own feedback as well, without it being completely broken. Some things that also need to be considered and touched on as well is the EMP drone. I don't know if the tank will have any form of countermeasure to deal with that. You could always put up the argument at why didn't you just shoot it down, but how mobile it is in game right now, honestly, that's going to be a very tall ask, especially when the turret gun depression and elevation in this game is not that generous. So that's possibly another thing that the game could address, which is probably critical to help tankers be a bit more versatile, flexible, and have more impacts in the game. See, small little things like that can actually make a huge difference without changing too many things at once. One thing I think a lot of tankers that have played previous Battlefield titles have failed to meet and understand how balance works and the best way to apply a patch to increase enjoyability, balance, and replayability of a game. And one of those things is changing too many things at once. If you consider how science works, right? If you want to do very good research, you would change one thing and focus on that and design a test protocol so that it can measure how effective that change was and if it made an impact. Now, think about that when balancing vehicles or guns or movement in this game, right? If you, for example, nerf the anti-tank weapons while buffing the tanks at the time, was it really the AT weapons that really needed to be changed and that's what made it the difference? Or was it the buffs that you actually made to the tank that made a difference? So potentially you just made something more worse and useless now, while at the same time giving tanks the ability to just roam free. You need to change a few things at a time and slowly work your way from there. And I feel addressing tank turret speed, that some of the defense measures that the tank can have in game, how effective they are to counter certain gameplay in the game, so certain AT weapons, applying more aggressive play, clutch situations, as well as having a fighting chance to get away from aircraft, or even maybe have a slight deterrence to them so that they don't push you as hard. These are things that would make a huge difference in how the tank feels in game and how they play in the greater schemes of the Conquest and any other game mode that it will be featured in. Not to sound like a broken record, just before I forget, one of the reasons why I am sympathetic but also think that people need to see the bigger picture of how the turrets work in this game is Hicks law. So basically Hicks law is the ability of how many inputs in front of you that you take in equals what your reaction time will be. So if you have 3 possible outcomes to a scenario, your reaction time is going to increase. So what I mean by increase, how long it's actually going to take, so you're making slower choices. With how thermal optics worked in Battlefield 3 and 4, plus the turrets being so mobile, it really didn't make much of an impact on how that works. Now, with how everything works in this game, it makes a huge difference. You need to figure out where your crosshead placement is in game, so it's reinforcing that, but also at the same time, figuring out where you're going to commit to pointing where your turret is. I'm not saying I totally agree with this, but I also agree that it could be done and implemented better, so then it's a bit more generous and not completely to the point where aggressive gameplay does not work for the tank to the extent it could possibly be without it being completely broken. And also, the repair tool needs to be addressed as well. So at this current point in the game, if you get in the vehicle after using it and it's overheated, it will stay overheated until you get back out and then let it cool down. This needs to be fixed because you could, for example, get out and repair, 10 minutes later it will still be overheated and not be able to be used. This is completely unrealistic, as well as completely unbalanced. So I think the way you could address this is simply, after you get into the vehicle, after a certain amount of time, say let's say 10 seconds, 15 or 20 seconds, then the cooldown will happen and you'll be able to use it as if it hadn't been used in the first place. If you apply that, it'll be a bit more rewarding and you would have a bit more aggressive gameplay, and as well as have a bit more clutch situations where you can get in and out of the vehicle, repair and move on and push the enemy. I do think how getting in and out of the vehicle in this game, I think they kind of try to please both sides of the party, where simply getting out of the vehicle has no animation, but getting into the vehicle has an animation, which was a bit similar, if I remember, to Battlefield 1. So it's not completely removing everything, but you can't kind of get away with the same system that you would use in Battlefield 3 and 4. So it's kind of, I guess, trying to please both sides of the party, and I'm happy with that for now. Anyway, I've gone over time for the length of the video that I wanted to produce here, and thought I'd give you some thoughts and ideas and address some similar things on the side. Anyway, I will be posting regularly footage, what I have remaining of Battlefield 4 and Battlefield 5 that I have left on my hard drive, as well as maybe making some montages. I haven't made montages for a while because generally they're not actually really giving you anything back as far as developing as players, like I would with these commentaries, but at least it's some form of entertainment and I get to kind of flex a little bit. I don't know if you guys will enjoy that kind of content. I'm still going to put it out anyway, see if you like it anyway, and move on from here.